Hello and welcome to this first Thistle Wind Partners podcast. Thistle Wind Partners, TWP. My name is Gavin MacKay. I'm the supply chain manager with TWP. I'm a Highlander based in Inverness, but today I'm here in Edinburgh at HQ with my colleagues to introduce our topic for the day, which is Mission Possible, Consenting an Offshore Wind Farm. What we mean is it's possible, but it's also a bit of a mission. So today we're going to illuminate how the process works. We're going to be getting beyond not just how energy projects are approved, but right into the permissions, beyond the turbines, and looking at the less obvious things like onshore cables and substations that are needed to get offshore wind to us onshore, to the consumers. So without further ado, I'm going to come to my colleagues to introduce themselves. There's combined experience across a pretty broad range indeed. So we've got marine science, environment, offshore technologies and supply chain, and electrical infrastructure. So Jean, over to you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Gavin. I'm Jean Lewis. Really nice to meet you all. And my role within TWP is the Energy Export Capacity Manager, which essentially means that I lead our grids and electrical engineering team.
Brilliant, thank you. And over to you, Hannah.
Hi Gavin, yes, and hello to everybody. My name's Hannah, so I'm the consents lead for TWP. So my responsibility is to make sure that we have the environmental approvals and consents in place before we can construct our projects.
So the first question people might ask is, what even is TWP, Thistle Wind Partners? So we're new kids on the block, so to speak. So let's cover that quickly before we get into the first topic. So can I look for a volunteer to introduce us in a nutshell with our two projects?
I'll have a go, Gavin. So Thistle Wind Partners, we're a consortia of 3 companies, 2 Belgian companies and 1 French. So our 2 Belgian companies are Demi Concessions, and we also have Aspiravi. And our French consortium partner is Care Marine. We're new, which is great, but we're also old in terms of we're using a lot of the existing experience both within our own team, from members of the team here who have worked within the industry for a long time, but also using the experience within the consortia partners, whether it be offshore marine, like Demi, or essentially producing electricity from renewable generation like both Aspiravi and Care Marine. So we're bringing all of that knowledge and expertise to the fore to actually take our 2 projects forward. Projects that we've got 2 ScotWind projects which are really exciting. We're in early development phase with them just now. Our Ayre project is 1,008 megawatts. It's offshore wind, as we've started to discuss. Our base case is it's going to be a floating project, which is pretty new technology just now. So there's lots of development going on in this area. We will probably have an onshore connection. So we'll connect to the onshore transmission owners network in the Caithness area, which is again really exciting because we'll be engaging with other developers as well as the onshore TO in that area. And we're looking to get this project connected in the early 2030s. So lots to do, even today. Our other project is Bowdun. Again, we're looking at a project that's 1,008 megawatts. It's actually off the coast of Aberdeenshire and will again connect onshore in the Aberdeenshire area, this time round about the Fiddis area. And this, a bit different to Ayre, this is a fixed project, so the technology is a bit more known. We're a bit more comfortable with it. And again, we're looking to get this connected in the kind of 2030s. And right now, we're in that early development phase where we're starting to kind of take our designs forward. We're looking at surveys at the moment just to really start to work out exactly what the project's going to look like. So it's a really exciting phase of the projects.
Why can't offshore wind farms stay offshore? So it's fair to say, but it's not often well understood, that part of the infrastructure for an offshore wind farm needs to come onshore. So Jean, you touched on that when introducing the projects. Could you go into a little bit more detail about the onshore element, how that works and what we need onshore?
Maybe just start with that original question, why can't offshore wind stay offshore? Technically, it could stay offshore. The issue that we've got at the moment is that in the UK, traditionally, all of our offshore wind projects have actually came onshore and connected to the onshore grid. We don't actually have an offshore grid currently in the UK, but we are starting to develop one. So we're just at the first stages of that. So potentially offshore wind can stay offshore. However, because we're right at that first stage of development, not all offshore winds can stay offshore. And for ourselves, because we're quite close to the coastline, and when I'm saying that, we're approximately 60 to 90 kilometres in terms of our distance from coast, it means that actually there is a potential for us to come onshore and join the UK network from an onshore perspective. In terms of that process, it means that we have to make an application to National Grid, which we've done. And essentially, National Grid will then look at across the UK network, and they look at the most efficient and economic option for any developer that looks to connect to the system. For ourselves, that means that we're going to connect into an area in Caithness called Spittal, and for our Bowdun project, we're going to connect into an area in Aberdeenshire, in the Fiddis area. In terms of what that's going to look like, we will need to have an offshore platform, which will house a substation, which essentially will be lots of kind of switches and transformers to transform the voltage. We will then connect cables to that substation, and they will come all the way back to shore. We'll have a transition point where essentially we'll transition from offshore to onshore cables, and those onshore cables will again run to a new onshore substation. That onshore substation will again house lots of equipment, switches, transformation to transform the voltage, and then finally we will connect into the UK grid system with the transmission owner's substation. So there will be a short run of cable, approximately 2 kilometres, and then we'll connect into the UK grid system at that point. As an alternative, other offshore wind developers are connecting kind of offshore onto brand new substations being developed offshore. But as I said, we're quite close to shore, relatively speaking, so we can connect onto the onshore grid system.
Brilliant. That's an ace answer, and sheds a lot of light on our plans and the need to come onshore. Thanks, Jean. Now it's time for our technical challenge feature. First up is Jean. Jean, you have 30 seconds to explain what a reactive compensation compound is.
So essentially, power flow, we want to maximise the amount of power flow that we have coming from our wind turbines back to shore. Once we get our cable length over about 10 to 15 kilometres, we start to get reactive compensation requirements, which essentially means that the power does no longer flow as much as what we want it to. So we need to compensate. So to do that, we can add compensation equipment. So that can either be on the offshore substation or the onshore substation. And essentially what that will do, it will increase the power flow flowing from the turbines back to shore. So that in essence is reactive compensation. Capacitor banks is a good example of something that we could do there.
Thanks, Jean. That was more than 30 seconds, but it was a good answer because now I think I get it. So there's an enormous amount of change to our energy infrastructure at the moment. It's not just in Scotland, but actually across the UK. Thinking about the a recent UK government report, it said that the grid build out needed to be almost on a wartime footing. Such as the scale of change. But in layman's term, team, can I come to you to just sort of describe why all this is needed? And if I'm living in a local area where there's going to be a substation, it's set to be built, or what would you say to me?
I suppose in terms of just thinking about that first part of the question, why do we need to do this? Essentially, if we're going to hit some of the net zero goals, whether it's 50 gigawatts by 2050 or 45 gigawatts by 2040, essentially the infrastructure that we have today, those pylons, those cables, those substations, they're not really fit for purpose. They were designed for an era where we didn't have the amount of renewable generation we have today. So they all need to be replaced. And it's a mass replacement. It's not just the odd substation here or the odd overhead line with the associated pylons. It's actually, we need brand new overhead lines to work alongside the existing. We need to step up the voltages. We need brand new substations where we've never considered having them before. And that is to get us to those net zero goals. So it's a huge, as you mentioned, it's a huge effort across the UK grid system. It's not in one local community. It's all over the UK that we need to look at how we're going to transform the grid system. And that obviously needs to be coordinated. And that's National Grid's job to try and coordinate that, using the transmission owners, the 3 UK transmission owners, to help them undertake that. And actually place those transmission owner substations around the grid system. And that's essentially where the developers then connect into. And now, because we are starting to move the grid offshore, that could be an offshore substation as well as an onshore substation like the ones that TWP will connect to. In terms of those local communities, one of the things that we really need to do is explain to them what a substation is, what it could look like, the size, the substation. Will it be noisy in terms of the equipment that we're going to have in there? Could we do anything innovative to actually make it useful to the community? And those are the kind of conversations we need to have. Why does it need to be there as opposed to being somewhere else? Why is it that's the right place to have it? So we need to there talk about, the coordinated approach, the National Grid, is actually, what they're trying to achieve and why it's best to have certain substations in certain areas. To be honest, we need to understand from the community, what do they want? By doing this, what could we actually do for them? So for me, a big part of this engagement that we need to have with communities is actually listening to them. Having a kind of major infrastructure build in their community, can be scary in terms of what it's going to leave, in terms of that lasting effect. But can we do something that could actually make it positive? We could use that space to build something that's useful to the community. It could be additional play parks. It could be actually using the substation itself. EV charging is another example. But again, it's that engagement to work out what really would be useful.
Hannah, I'm going to come to you next on consent. But before I do, is there anything that you would add to that? What would you say to me as somebody in a community where a substation is set to be built?
I think, as Jean says, it's really important to set the context of why these developments are happening, and also to make it kind of clear to communities how that relates back to them in their day-to-day lives. We're all aware of kind of net zero, and we hear climate change and the significance of these things that are going on in the world around us, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the local community and when they're faced with these potential infrastructure developments in their areas. but it's trying to relate back that kind of how they live their lives and why this kind of infrastructure is necessary. And as Jean says, through our consent process, we have to consider, what the impacts are going to be, but we have to think about opportunities to enhance the local community, but also to mitigate any impacts that we may have, to come about with the best design solution that we can that's kind of fit for purpose in terms of what's needed, but also cognizant of kind of this community environment that we're placing ourselves into.
I'm going to come to you now on the consenting topic, your specialist area. Can you explain the process for getting onshore? Getting onshore and offshore consents. Is it a mission?
It is a mission, but not impossible, thankfully. The consents processes can be quite complex and therefore quite challenging to understand, particularly when you're kind of communicating with the local communities and the public and so forth. There's different regimes for onshore and offshore. When we're in the onshore environment, it's about getting planning permission. So that's a more kind of traditional approach that probably more people understand and can appreciate in terms of, if you want to build a new house, you have to go and get planning approval from your local planning authority to do that. We effectively have to do the same. It's a larger scale planning application process we go through, because these will be classed as national planning developments, because they sit within the national planning framework as seen as an important energy infrastructure to support the offshore renewables. So we'll have to go through that process, which is engagement with the local planning authority. We will have to do a number of stakeholder events and community engagement to feed into our process and our planning application. And importantly, alongside that, we will also have to undertake environmental impact assessment. So that's a legal requirement for us to do that. And there's very kind of sort of set ways and methods by which you do it. And fundamentally, it's a decision-making process to support those that make the decision, so the planning authority, to fully understand what the potential impacts may be of these projects, to help inform them when they're making the decisions as to whether they should grant consent or permit planning approval or not. From an offshore perspective, we sit under the Electricity Act regime, so it's a specific type of consent application that we go for called a Section 36, which probably doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people, but if you're in this world, we talk about it all the time. But it's to do with the generation capacity of these offshore wind farms. And then supporting that will also be a marine licence. And again, the offshore consents will have to be supported by environmental impact assessment in the same way. There's a huge number of stakeholders involved that we have to engage with, both statutory, so we formally have to engage with them, plus kind of interested parties, whether that's local communities or fishers or, the Lighthouse Board Association, mariners of all kinds and shapes and forms. So it's a very robust process and a well-recognised process. But as you say, is it a mission? They're very lengthy to get consents. It takes a long time in terms of the work that we have to undertake. So, for example, we have to have 2 years of bird data to support our offshore application. So that's data gathering for a really long period of time. Preparation of all that information so that it can go to the right people so that they can understand what's happening, what our impacts are going to be. So that's one of the challenges that we have to work through, recognising that there's lots of other developers doing the same thing at the same time. So we have to work with the Marine Directorate around how we can bring these projects forward. And there's some key challenges, particularly for our sites in relation to birds and ornithology, that we have to work through as well.
I guess it's all about making good, balanced decisions that look at net zero, they look at environment, the economy, and allowing the approval authorities to reach decisions that strike the best balance.
Yeah, I mean the ultimate aim of environmental impact assessment as a process is projects with better environmental outcomes, and socioeconomic factors also fall under that kind of legislative regime. So we do have to assess, what's the socio-economic impact, most people see impact as a negative thing, but it's also the benefits as well that can come from these projects. So, we'll have lots of discussions, and I'm sure there'll be an up and coming episode for the podcast in terms of supply chain and all the opportunities that will create. There's also the job opportunities and things that will come out of this. So there's the environmental aspects are obviously critical, but there is the wider piece as well that will come through the consents.
Hannah, in 30 seconds, please explain to us the difference between an EIA, a scoping report, and a planning application.
Well, EIA refers to Environmental Impact Assessment, which is a legal process. So it's a statutory process that we have to follow to get consent. Scoping is part of an EIA. So you scope with regulators to identify what you're going to write about in your EIA. And to get an opinion back from them, you prepare a scoping report that you submit to say how you're going to go about doing your EIA. And then a planning application is effectively the consent for the onshore element. So we'll go to the local planning authority and ask for planning permission to be able to build what we need to build.
Brilliant. Thank you. Super clear and all in 30 seconds. So hopefully that was helpful for everybody listening online as well. I'm now going to introduce our second topic, which is offshore wind bringing negative impacts? And for this, I'm going to bring in Nick Moore. Nick, your specialist topic is the offshore environment. Could you say a few words of introduction before we move into the topic?
Yeah, that's fine. So my name's Nick Moore. I am the Offshore Consents Manager for Thistle Wind Partners, background in marine biology, and I've worked in the industry for about 18 years now.
Thanks, Nick. Now, a big part of your work at the moment is working with the fishing businesses to agree cooperation payments for times when they can't fish due to our site surveys offshore. What do you think are the biggest myths about how this works?
I suppose ultimately it's probably relating to the fact that it's all evidence-based. Ultimately, a portion of our money for our development comes from the public purse, so it's this perception that ultimately we have to verify the impact from our development on the fishing industry. So whether that be a request for their takings for the year, for the amount of gear they have in our development area that we're looking to survey. So yeah, ultimately it's all about evidence-based disclosures when it comes to fishing impacts. And so we have to assess what level of fishing is in the area, who fishes, what level of fishing, how many creels they might have.
What do you think needs to happen to harmonise the relationship between offshore wind developers, transmission operators, fishing businesses first, but then also communities more widely?
I think there's a lot that needs to happen in terms of understanding all of the parties and where they're coming from. I think, it's easy to recognise that there has been impacts to fishing businesses on previous developments and previous undertakings of work on other projects. But recognising, as we've already discussed around some of the other challenges, is that there is a need for these projects, and therefore we need to find a solution to work together. At the moment, there isn't specific regulation around engagement, particularly with fishing businesses. There's guidance that is kind of industry recognised standards of guidance, but there's quite a lot of ambiguity in that and how that can be applied, and also what maybe the expectation or understanding is around it.
Ultimately, the flow guidance that we follow right now is based on is guidance in words. Ultimately, it requires all parties to buy into it. So there's an element that potentially individuals may not want to buy into that sort of flow guidance. So it's the ability to sort of lock down understandings of reassuring fishers that they will get adequately compensated for the interruption to their fishing, but also it gives security to oil and gas developers, renewables developers and the like to basically give us certainty over our expenditures over the lifetime of a project. Ultimately, if it's an independent adjudicator that overviews the evidence and stipulates our cooperation payment levels, then so be it. But ultimately, there has to be some sort of more tightly controlled way of this going about this, especially when it comes to our deadlines. Our survey sort of programs are so tight that it ultimately these processes, if they're drawn out, have sort of quite substantial impacts on our survey programs and also our project costs.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. I'm going to ask a daft laddie question, and if you could just explain flow guidance for me, please.
Yeah, so flow guidance was brought around in 2008, actually. So it's basically an agreement, a guidance document agreed through both the renewables, wet renewables they were called, so basically anything to do with offshore wind, tidal and tidal turbines, subsea tidal turbines, and it was agreed with the fishing industries at the time to establish a protocol basically of how we go about engaging the fishing industry and recognising the disturbance factor and also even the permanent impact factor when it comes to actually operational wind farms, and how we can basically work together to ensure that both parties are truly sort of respected and have an open conversation between the two parties.
Fantastic, thank you. So a common language here is really actually critical to ensuring that everybody knows where they stand and that we all make good decisions. So over to you both for thoughts on what other changes beyond the common language might need to be made to the consents process.
There's definitely a need, I think, for a degree of innovation in terms of the consenting process. It's quite... these processes have been in statute and regulation for a long time, so there's quite a kind of a standard traditional way to go about getting consent and doing your environmental impact assessment. And those can be very time consuming and resource heavy across all aspects, whether that's the developer, through the consultancy sector, but also for the regulator as well. They're having to review significant amounts of information. So it's kind of recognised that it's a resource heavy process, but you can't necessarily minimise the work that needs to be done, because it's important to understand what the potential environmental impacts are going to be. And, from being part of the European and also from an international environmental law perspective, there's the precautionary principle. So the absence of information means that the regulator has to be precautionary in their approach to consenting. So there's a lot of work going on at the moment around developers working together to pool resources in terms of developing environmental baseline. So birds are a key issue that we talked about earlier. And it's kind of recognising that there's a number of different types of studies and approaches that you can take to collect that information that will, hopefully inform better consent applications, but also give the regulator more comfort, because they're not just looking at things on a project by project basis, it's more in the round. And I think this is probably one of the kind of clear examples of where you see developers coming together to do that kind of thing. That's quite unusual normally when you look at development process and consenting. But there'll be a need to do other aspects, in terms of innovation and how we think. Nick in the not too distant future is going to be having similar conversations around shipping and navigation. We're also looking at other aspects where this kind of developer collaboration, so a big word that's used a lot in terms of consenting and ScotWind is collaboration, and there's kind of no way that we can really bring forward these projects without collaboration, and I think that has the biggest kind of potential benefit in terms of making that consent process more streamlined and more efficient for everybody.
Listen, those were really full answers to that to topic 2. So thank you both. Next up in the Geotechnical Challenge, I'm going to introduce Nick Moore. Nick, I'm going to come to you in 30 seconds. I'd like you to explain the difference between geophysical, geotechnical and Met Ocean and benthic surveys.
Okay, so geophysical is a remote sensing survey, so it looks at the subsurface sort of layers within the seabed. A geotechnical survey, is looking at the physical properties of the seabed, so that's taking either samples from the seabed or trying to using equipment to push down into it to look at the physical properties. Met Ocean is looking at subsurface currents and water movements within the water column. And then finally, benthic surveys tend to be related to the environmental side of things. So that's taking mud samples, looking at the seabed, looking at what lives in the seabed from a biological point of view.
Well done, all in 30 seconds. So I'm going to introduce the last section of the podcast. So before we go, let's have a chat about the bigger picture. There are conflicting views about the UK's energy future. We've all seen the news about UK government shifting focus towards carbon capture and fossil fuels again. We all work in offshore wind because we believe in it for the planet, for the environment. For me, it's the economy and the potential to build an industry here in Scotland and the UK. But if you were to sell ScotWind, why should people living here in Scotland support it? So, Jean, will I come to you first?
No problem. It's generated such a furore, and I would say in a positive, certainly from my own perspective, really positive impact. ScotWind is talked about around the world, the size of what we're trying to do here. You know, the original, it was supposed to be 10.8. County Scotland went for 25 gigawatts. You know, the stir that caused, but the potential benefit, as Hannah's already mentioned, for supply chain, for growth of industry, for growth of jobs, you know, for STEM, for supporting young people as they're coming through their careers, whether that's from primary school level all the way up to university. You know, we're growing in industry. So I think it's fantastic. You know, I think without having ScotWind, would we have tried to grow this industry as quickly? I think we wouldn't. You know, don't get me wrong, we've got lots to do, you know, in terms of supply chain, in terms of bringing new industry into the country, in terms of growing those skills that we need. However, it's a good challenge to have, you know, and I think it's a really positive one. And certainly it's probably, in my 25 years in the industry, this has probably been the most exciting time. You know, we're trying to push boundaries in technology, we're trying to push supply chain, you know, we're trying to grow jobs. It's really exciting time to be in Scotland. So I think it's fantastic.
Thanks, Sheen. So, Hannah, I'll come to you. So we've had technology, we've had scale, we've had industry development. The positive impacts from that are, like Jean says, we've got a lot of work to do to realise those, but the potential is massive. Over to you. Sell ScotWind
to you. So I think the level of ambition is inspiring, really. And as Jean says, it's not just about Scotland. This really puts Scotland on a global stage, and this is about kind of developing a kind of global market, really, for Scotland and the opportunities that it brings. From a personal perspective, you know, I'm an environmental scientist by my background, you know, really aware of the global challenge that we faced in terms of climate change and the impact that that's having on us at a planetary level, you know, huge impacts on biodiversity, and, you know, there's lots that we need to think about from an environmental perspective. And with that, we have to think outside of the box. We can't carry on as we have done. We can't just keep progressing and using fossil fuels and other resources without really thinking about it. So offshore wind provides an opportunity with that renewables to kind of really scale up from things in a way that we've not really seen or thought before. It makes me really proud to be Scottish, to be honest, that I, you know, get to work on these kind of projects and the change that they will bring about on so many levels, but also to be doing that in terms of an environmentally considerate way.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys. And I think a key word in there was pride or proud, and that's certainly how I feel working in this incredible sector, trying to do good, powerful things. So brilliant. So thank you, Nick, Hannah and Jean. I suspect this will not be the last time we discuss these topics. Listeners, thank you too. I hope you found out something new and useful today. We're ready to answer any questions that you have. So please use the links for our social media channels. Thank you.